Hi, it's Dr. P, Ryerson University professor in the School of Health Services Management. I'm here to talk to you today about a report that was recently released by Ryerson University. It's the Anti-Black Racism Campus Climate Review, and it revealed, just as we're seeing across the world, that staff, faculty, and students that self-identify as Black are experiencing discrimination. And as a result of this, I anticipate that the university is going to be taking steps to address the issues that have been raised through this review. Thankfully, it was done. It's a first step. But I always tell my students, because I teach all courses related to research, that first thing you want to do when you're thinking about how to address an issue as large and robust as this one would be to look at the data. So I went to the data. We have what we call a self-ID report that's done every single, well, at least the self-ID reports that are reported by Ryerson University have been done in 2014, 15, 16, and 18. We, interestingly, have no report that's up for 2019 or 2020, so that's important to note. The other thing, it begs the question of what is our representation at Ryerson University? Because we clearly know that one of the best ways to address discrimination would be through a process where we have a representative, a number of individuals that are experiencing the discriminatory behavior. In this case, would be Black people, right? So we want to make sure that we have a representative number of Black people in both that our staff and faculty that mirror what we see in our surrounding population. So in this case, it would be the GTA, and as well too in our larger community, right? So, and actually we want it to be also representative of what our student pool looks like, right? Because our students are also another measure in terms of adequate representation. And clearly when we look at the data, there's quite a lot of alarming things that stick out. I mean, interestingly, a comparison between 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2018's data reveals that while we've made a little bit of an improvement in terms of our racial representation overall, because first, Ryerson teases out a bunch of special populations, and racial representation is one of, well, ethnic representation is one of those categories. They also look at the division of women. They look at other special populations as well too. The Aboriginal representation, which is also very, very low, alarmingly and concerningly low. But once they break down all the racialized groups or look at the entire racialized group as a whole, they'll break it down according to different categories that have been identified on this self-ID survey that's given out to staff. And for the most part, I would believe that, or imagine that we do this every single year, staff and faculty, but I haven't seen any data reported for 2019 or 2020. So I can only report the very latest, which is up to 2018. So what we see is that we've seen some progression or improvement with regards to our racial representations. We've gone from 31% to 32% and then up to 34% in this last 2018 reported data. But then when you look at the Black representation, we start to see things fall apart in terms of the transparency with which we're reporting our data. So in 2014, you see that there's an 11% reported representation of Black people across campus. Now, if you look at what this represents in overall employees, it's really, really low. It's 3.4% of the entire overall employees at Ryerson University in 2014. So then in 2015, we see that we have a little bit of a jump, like I said. We jumped to 32% of racialized employees. But then there's no provided number for what representation is, or what portion of that 32% is made up by Black employees, staff, and faculty. Then you look at 2016, we have reported data again for the group as a whole, 32%. We see for all racialized groups, that's representation relative to, or with respect to Ryerson's employees, 32% represent as some or identify with some background that is considered racialized or identified as racialized. And when we look at what percentage of that represents Black individuals, we see that it jumped a bit to 15%. But if you look at the fact that we had an overall jump and then we had a little rise in our representation of Black people at 15%, it's not so great. We did jump overall. If you look at the actual number or percentage representation of Black employees, it jumped from 3.41% to 5% in 2016. But if we look a little closer at that data, we'll see that of that 5% representation of Black individuals or Black people and Black employees at Ryerson University, only 11% represent faculty members. Then 28% seem to be in, of this 5% again, right? 28% appear to be in unionized professions, right? So with some degree of job stability. And then we have 26% that appear to be in a non-unionized position. So that's kind of concerning that 1/4 of that very small amount to begin with, in this case 5%, which probably represents about 400 overall employees. Well, 100 of those employees don't have any job stability, right? And again, these are people, individuals that identify as Black. So when we look at 2018 data, we then see that we've seen a little bit of a growth in our racialized representation to 34%. So now we've got a 34% representation of racialized employees at Ryerson, of which we now see that there are 16% that identify as Black in the survey. And then we see that that represents a 5.4% representation of the overall employees. So we haven't moved the dial in strides by no means over this period in time. If anything, we've made small improvements. But given that this report was just recently released, and this notion, and which is supported by an abundant amount of research, that we know that in order to combat discrimination, particularly racism in the form of this form of discrimination, we really need a representative number of staff and faculty that speak to or that share the same racial identity, in this case being Black, as the to help combat this, right? So I mean, this is kind of the first step, and we're really far away. If we think about first steps and the things that need to be done, we're very, very far away from where we need to be. And in fact, Ryerson, over the last, I think one of the largest concerns to me is that I can tell you guys about data from 2014, and I can tell you about data from 2016, and I can tell you about data from 2018, but then what happened? We didn't even report anything for 2019, and we don't have anything up for 2020. And the more concerning bit is that after 2016, we stopped stratifying our data to look at exactly what representation of Black employees, what sectors they're in. So are they in unionized positions, non-unionized positions, faculty positions, non-faculty positions? I can't tell you that. So we actually took a step back. In 2016, we had very transparent data where we not only looked at it by each of those ethnic represented groups or how we self-identify, and there's 10 different groups, and so one of those is Black, and but there's a number of other groups, and we don't basically beyond that one breakdown, we don't break down then of the people that represent as being Black, how many of those are working in staff positions and in unionized staff positions, or how many of them are contract lecturers, and how many of them are associate professors, assistant professors, or full professors. So that breakdown is not being done anymore. Despite the fact that the data is actually being gathered, we're not really showing or sharing that information. And actually nothing's been shared for past 2018. So it's difficult to discern whether we've continued to move in the direction that promotes more hiring of Black people, because clearly, we went from 3.41 in 2014 to 5%, just over 5% right now, and we're sort of holding steady without anything more to report. And that in the context of what we recently found out with this anti-Black racism climate review does not bode well for Ryerson. So the whole question is when we say that Black Lives Matters, does Ryerson really believe that Black Lives Matter? That's the concern I have because, looking at the data, it seems to be that that question is a difficult one to answer. But at the same time, it looks to me like they don't matter nearly as much as they need to. That's, that being said, they don't matter to the point that the Black representation in Ryerson's University, both in staff and faculty positions, does not reflect community representation of Black people. And it by far does not represent the number of students that represent or identify as Black. So as a starter, we're not even meeting the averages that you see in both the community and in our own representation of students. We're nowhere near where we need to be. So clearly, it's concerning, and it leaves the question of whether Ryerson is addressing the situation in a way that will actually help to really address and combat this ever-increasing racism that we're seeing that's present with regards to the treatment of all individuals, but most importantly, Black individuals. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope to bring many more of these to you because I'm starting to sift through a lot of data, and I'd love to share my take on it with you guys. Thanks.